Just a fair warning before the video begins. This video will not be spoiler free. I'll be going over my thoughts of this book, including spoilers. So, as you can see, I'm trying something kind of different. Got a bit of a new setup going here. Yeah, got the green screen. Got the cursed. This is a GPU based green screen, and as long as I don't move too quickly, it's pretty good. If I do this, whoa, my room exists again. So, it's imperfect, but I'm not painting a wall green. I'm whatever. Like I'm not buying a big old thing to put down behind my entire fucking room. My room is tiny. It is absolutely fucking minuscule. It's basically like a cupboard that I have as in my 2-bedroom house in my UK poverty box, and basically this is this is like the best I can do. It just is not possible for me to fit all my stuff in here and also have a green screen. So this is what I'm working with. Okay, it's the best I can do. I would like to get a wireless microphone, but they kind of sound like shit, and I don't have the space to set up like a receiver and all this stuff. I just don't. So it's waiting until I move, until in the foreseeable future I move into my own place. But I'm trying a new thing. Hopefully I can like do some gestures. I can be like, yo, this is this character. So this is the book I'm reading. Bam, and it can pop up. This is the book. This is my favorite book. Bam. If you saw my green screen test video, but this is what it's all about. I can be like, so, I'm I kind of like this character. He's kind of cool. Or I can be like, fuck this character. Fuck this bit. Fucking hate you. Yeah, anyway. So, today, I'm going to be talking about Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. There it is. Warbreaker. You can't really see it because my camera's not very good, but it has a shiny pink Brandon Sanderson. But not shiny pink Warbreaker, which is the name of the book, which is in black, which is a bit weird, I think. But that it is what it is. This is a standalone Cosmere novel. And I was going to read the Brandon Sanderson books, and I saw the Brandon Sanderson books, the Stormlight Archives specifically, and someone commented on one of my Mistborn videos, saying, "Yo, read Warbreaker before you read those. Read Warbreaker, dude. You gotta read it, because it's relevant in Stormlight Archives. That Cosmere interconnectivity, okay." So I'm like, okay, sure, I'll read it. Fuck it, I'll read it. To be honest with you, I was putting off reading Stormlight Archives. Them be long ass books, and to be honest with you, they kind of seem horrible to read. So I was kind of procrastinating reading reading them, and that's kind of why I read Spaceman and Bohemia, which turned out to be a fucking awesome book. And yeah, I kind of was like, fuck it, I'll read it. So I'm in Waterstones. I'm kind of walking around, I'm looking at books, and I see it. I'm like, oh shit, that's that book that guy told me to read. So I grab it, and I can bring it home and I read it. To be honest with you, I'll get this out of the way. I think this book's pretty fucking mid. Of all the books I've read from Brandon Sanderson so far, this is my least favorite one, by like a significant margin. I would say this is like a 3 stars for me. Like, if I had to give it, like, a star rating, I don't really like using those, and they're a bit reductive, but I guess they do their job, There's a lot of reasons that I feel that way about this book. There are things that I really liked about it, There are things that I did really like about it, but there are also things I really didn't like about it, so, I'm going to be a bit more critical of this one than I am about most books. I've kind of had, some mixed feelings about it. So yeah, I think that'll do for the intro. I'll go on to, like, a quick summary about the book, kind of, like, roughly what the book's about, for those of you who haven't read it. Complete spoilers. We ain't fucking around. I'm spoiling the shit out of this book. So don't watch this if you haven't read the book. These books are supposed to be a diary of my reading experience, and they're not supposed to be reviews. So, if you're here to like see what someone thinks about this book, before you go read it, you're in the wrong place. Go elsewhere. Do not be here. So I am going to talk about the summary of this book, kind of what it's roughly about, and I'll talk a little bit about what I did and didn't like about it. and then I'll have some conclusions and final thoughts. So, yeah, let's begin. So, this book, the plot setup's a bit complicated, I suppose. But basically, it's pretty, in the most simple terms, we're in a situation in a planet in the Cosmere. I think it's called Nalthis. And basically, you have two countries. One is called Idris, and one is called Haladron. Idris and Haladron were originally one country. They're originally one nation, and eventually there was a war, and basically a rebel faction broke off and went and formed their own country with blackjack and hookers, and they called this Idris. And basically, our two main characters come from Idris. In fact, they are the two princesses of the king of Idris. And they basically, after the war, there was a kind of a peace agreement. And that peace agreement was that once this king had his... on the 20th year, I think it was, or 22nd year, something like that, of the war ending, he would give one of his daughters, one of his the descendants of his lineage, of the female variety, to basically marry the God King, who is this kind of like godlike being that is extremely magically powerful, godlike being that is worshipped in Haladron. Brandon Sanderson really has a hard-on for there being god kings, men who are but men, worshipped as gods, it seems. And basically, the book starts with these two princesses. One of them, who I would consider to be the more interesting of the two, is called Siri, who is basically this kind of woman who is the third or fourth, can't remember, in line to the throne. So basically, she's never gonna become queen. It's never gonna happen. She has basically, because she's the fourth in line, she's basically been allowed to do whatever she wants. She's a bit of a rebel. She doesn't do what she's told. She doesn't keep up with the studies. She fucks around. She doesn't strictly follow the teachings of the religion from the place that she was born. And there's also Vivenna, who is basically the perfect model daughter, who has been raised her whole life to be basically as cattle, to get married off, and trigger warning for sexual assault in this, raped repeatedly by the God King until she spawns a scion of their family line, and essentially is just a piece of meat, as agreed in the treaty. And at the start of the book, the king is like, well, shit, I really don't want to send this daughter because she's the best, right? I've trained her how to do everything. She's really good at politics. She's amazing. She can perfectly control her. The royal family have this thing called the royal locks, where their hair changes color to match their current emotional state, and they're generally taught how to do it. And this is kind of a way that Brandon Sanderson shows the two main personality traits between these two characters, right? Siri cannot control her locks whatsoever and has never learnt to do so, all of her emotions are shown on her sleeve. Her hair changes colour to do with her in line with her emotions, whereas Vivienne, she's very perfectly, basically, sorry, Vivenna, I'm saying her name wrong. Vivenna. Saying it completely wrong. Vivenna. Spoilers. I don't like this character. She, very, very forgettable character in my opinion. She, basically is the perfect princess, and he wants her to stay in Haladron, Idris, so that she can basically take over Idris when he dies, because he's trained her to be the perfect daughter. So he's like, actually, the treaty doesn't technically say it has to be my oldest daughter. I can send any of my daughters. It just has to be 20 years after the war's ended. So instead, he takes his most useless, youngest, heavily underaged daughter to go and get repeatedly raped by the God King. Great start. And then his Siri, the one who gets sent, the younger sister, her sister also gets sent to Haladron. Well, she doesn't actually. She sneaks off to Haladron. Her simp, a guy who's like into her, from her perspective, anyway, in her opinion. That's why he's come along. He's basically just like a guard who she was going to be married to, who Viv was going to get married to, basically. And that's the start of the book. They go to this place called Haladron. It is a colourful coastal city, with a heavy cultural focus on wearing brilliant colours, on beauty, and on excess, which is very different to Idris, where they're from. Our two main characters, who are from a country that is very kind of demure, and they only wear grey, and they're obsessed with being frugal and not being frivolous, and generally leading these kind of monkly lives, which is the complete opposite of Haladrim. And that's basically the beginning of our story, and there is a war brewing, is the other main thing. Basically, there is a war brewing, and it is believed that, at least by many of the characters in this book, that the war is inevitable between Haladrim and Idris, and it's just a case of when it happens. So that's basically the setup of this book. It's called Warbreaker because the main characters in this book are all trying to stop the war from happening. They're trying to break the war. They're trying to war break. It's, that's actually not why it's called that. That's what I thought it was called that, but it's not. It's not called that for that reason. At the end, it turns out it's because one of the characters here was called Warbreaker, and he's in the book. But, we'll get on to talking about the book, what I thought about it. Very mixed feelings about this book. There's things I really liked, and things that I really didn't vibe with. And, there's characters as well that I didn't really vibe with and things like that, so we'll get into it. And I'll talk about the things I liked first. How about that? We start off with the good. Alright, so, the good. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the thing that I loved the most about this book, which I really, really did enjoy. And that was Siri and Susebron, who is the God King, and their story. And God forbid I say it, because I know this is an unpopular opinion, but the fucking romance, okay? I know everybody hates Brandon Sandersons' romance, okay? People are like, oh, the romance in Mistborn is shit. The romance in this book is shit. Brandon Sandersons is not good at romance. Yeah, well, you know what I think? I think that your brain is rotted by all this unrealistic fairy tale bullshit romance that you read all the time. The way Brandon Sanderson writes romance is how real life relationships work, okay? Two people meet, they like each other, and they get together. How many people do you know have these crazy fairy tale stories of fucking getting together, okay? It's shit, it's overdone, it's overblown. I love a good romance, but it has to be grounded, man. And it has to be based in the relationship of those two people. The best romances that exist, in my view, are the romances where the characters are already together, okay? Where it's about that building of their relationship, about how the difficulties they face in a relationship and how they overcome them, okay? Which is really what I liked about the Mistborn romance between Elend and Vin, because that's what that book was, a character arc of their relationship, of them coming to trust each other and becoming basically the perfect partners for one another. And ultimately the way it tied into Vin's character arc of being an untrusting little skeevy little shit to being a trusting heroic badass bitch was cool as fuck and was really well done. And you know what? I liked the romance in this book. Fuck you, people who hate Brandon Sanderson's romance. I thought this was fucking great. I thought it was really well done. No, seriously, in all seriousness, if that's how you feel, fair enough. I'm not here to tell you your opinion's wrong. But for me, I really like I'm engaged to my partner, to my fiance, okay? How did we meet? Okay, we met at the Anime Society, and we just were immediately attracted to one another. And then within a week, we were dating. There was no romance, you know what I mean? Then we just entered into a serious relationship 2 weeks in, and then we started boning, and then the rest is the rest is history, bro. We've just been together since then. It's not that deep, Most people don't have a romance, you know what I mean? That's not how real life relationships work, and that's what I like about this book. There's two people who are just mashed together and they just fall in love, and there's no logic to it. They just like each other. They're just attracted to each other. They just fall in love in a way that they would in a realistic way. They just do, and I really like that. And also just the story in general. I thought Siri was by far the better of the two sisters. I'll get into the things I don't like because I didn't really like Vivenna that much. Mostly it's a pacing issue, but didn't really like her story that much. I really, really liked Siri's story in this book, and I liked her as a character, and I really, really liked specifically her relationship with Susebron, which is, I think how you say it, the God King, and the slow reveal that he is actually not a piece of shit and is actually a slave to the system himself. And let's talk about Susebron for a bit. What a cutie patootie. What a fluffy little fella. Goddamn, he's like this imposing, huge 8-foot Master Chief of a man, who just like stares at her when she's naked, for like the first third of the book, and then it turns out it's because he's scared and he doesn't know how to have sex, and also like he can't speak, he's got his tongue cut out, and he's just so innocent, and he slowly learns how to speak, so he teaches him how to draw, and that's how to write, and that's how they communicate, and they're like secretly whispering to each other at night and all this stuff, and she's like doing this fake thing where she's like pretending to have sex with him on the bed, like making the noise so that all the priests think that they've actually had sex, and then you know the whole thing, their relationship. This story I thought was by far the most interesting of the two two main storylines that are going three main storylines that are going on. I don't want to dwell on this for too long because I don't think any of the characters in this book are particularly deep. They don't have much depth. They're just kind of very basic storytelling. This book is heavily hampered by its length, by its standalone, in my view, its standalone kind of situation, and also it has pretty poor pacing, in my view. So even with all those flaws, this story really shined through for me. At the end, I was like, shit. I actually thought fuck, I don't know what's gonna happen. And it thoroughly gripped me throughout the whole thing. So Siri and Susebron's romance, their story. So I really would. I would like to see a sequel to this to see what happens with Susebron actually becoming the actual God King and actually running the country and seeing how that goes, because he's obviously not going to be a good king, and I think that would be an interesting character arc to see him learning how to be a king. Those characters, just thought they were great. Just thought they were they were basically likable. They were likable on the basic likability scale, and you can't really go wrong with that. There's no crazy depth here. There's nothing crazy going on here storytelling wise. It's just good. It's just solid. Every time I had a chapter from Siri's perspective, I was looking forward to it, and I was in, and I was engaged, and I was invested, which I can't say for all of the stories in this book. So next we'll go on to the next thing that I liked about this book. The next thing I liked about this book, Lightsong and Co. That is Lightsong, Blushweaver, and his main priest, whose name I don't remember currently. This story was, plot-wise, not necessarily character-wise, the most interesting. And I thought of all the characters in this book, besides Vasher, Lightsong was the most endearing character and the most likable. And I really, really liked his relationship, his kind of like teasing relationship with Blushweaver. I thought the dialogue was really good. I thought the Returned are super interesting concept, world building wise. I thought all of the world building that was done through the story was the best of all the world building. We'll get into the things I didn't like about the world building later, but the Returned, the kind of court of gods, the way that politically interacts with the rest of the world, the way that they're actually just like animals in a pen who have no freedom, that whole thing was super interesting. Lightsong's, the end of Lightsong's story actually almost made me cry. The way that when he touched Susebron, he's like, my breath to yours, that I was like, no fam, not my favourite character, don't fucking do this, but I guess it had to happen, because Lightsong's character arc in this book of going from this useless, like deliberately pointless god to the only god of all of the gods in the entire fucking thing, who's actually willing to take any fucking action, any responsibility, and do anything to try and do something about the goddamn situation, was really great. He's like a child, Lightsong. He was like this naive child that you just couldn't help but kind of you couldn't help but want to see him succeed, want to see him, because you can tell he's not the person that he's presenting himself to be, that he is a better person than he thinks he is, and he seems to be the only god who actually gives a shit at all. Obviously, later on, there are more that are trying, and there was one who he had a relationship with in the past who was kind of something for them all to strive for, who eventually gave her life away. But yeah, I just thought Lightsong, this whole storyline was the strongest storyline by, plot-wise, by a significant margin. I do think character-wise, Lightsong himself is the strongest character in this entire thing, but I think Siri and Susebron as a pair are just kind of slightly above that in terms of how much I enjoyed in general. But Lightsong as a character was, I thought, really strong, and I really, really liked him. This book has pacing issues, full stop, regardless of what storyline it is, I think. But this was by far the strongest set of characters, and their relationships to one another is really interesting. I mean, it's a difficult one for me between Siri and Susebron's story in this, but like I think Siri and Susebron's is slightly higher up. But this one was fucking awesome as well, and really good, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, so that is Lightsong and Co. So Blushweaver as well. Talk a little bit about Blushweaver. I thought she was a really interesting side character. Again, not much in the way of depth or anything, but I think that's because a lot of these characters, they're limited by the page count, they're limited by the fact that it's a standalone book, and they're limited by the fact that, in my view, the worst character arc just sucks up a shit ton of pointless page count that could have really been used to flesh these characters out more, and really just massively strengthened the book. But unfortunately, that is not the final product with this book. So yeah, so these characters, I think, if the priest and Blushweaver had more time to cook, they could have also been phenomenal, really great characters for what they are. I don't want to give you like a weird idea that the characters in these books are going to be like George R. R. Martin, or like, you know, Joe Abercrombie levels of character writing, or even comparable to like the characters in Brandon Sandersons' other books that I've read, like the Mistborn books. They're not. They're simply not on that level. But for what they are, they're likable, they're funny, and you know, they're sympathetic. So you know, for that, they get points. That, you know, it was at least entertaining, even if I thought the book overall was a bit mid. This was a part that I really liked. Same with Siri and Susebron's story. The just in general, their whole story was cool. The twists were cool. Everything that was going on was interesting, even if it could drag on a bit at times. Lightsong and Co. gets a thumbs up from me. I really like that element of this book. The next person or character I want to talk about is Vasher. So Vasher is this mysterious character who we're introduced to at the start. He is actually the viewpoint character for the first chapter in this book. And it's kind of not clear what his goals are, who he is, what he wants, who he's allied with, even what side of the war he stands, anything like that. And for that reason, he is the most interesting, I think, character in this book. Even if he's not, it's a shame he doesn't have more viewpoint characters. I think, viewpoint chapters. I think it's a shame he doesn't have more viewpoint chapters. I think, but he by far was the most intriguing character because you wanted to know more about him more than any other character, I thought, in this book. And you do get that as the book progresses. You do get what you wanted, and you know, his whole past is revealed and everything. And I do have some gripes about some of the world building regarding the history of this world and how it's integrated into the story. And unfortunately, this does bring Vasher's whole story down a bit, because he's basically a lore character. He's like a DMPC that's coming from the past, who's like immortal, basically. And he's just getting involved with all this shit. And we can't talk about Vasher without not talking about Nightblood as well. So Nightblood is this sword that Vasher has that was created, and he awakened it. And, well, it wasn't him actually, it was his some chick, Dent's sister or something, basically created an object and created a sentient object. So basically it's just a magic item from D&D, like with the sentience thing. And basically it talks, it thinks that it is a tool for destroying evil, but doesn't understand the complexities of those ideas. It is a sword. It doesn't have any moral reasoning. It just kills things, and what it kills, it says it says those things are evil, essentially. But it's pretty cool. Vasher goes apeshit with it at the end. It like burns all his breaths away and fuels the sword, and he goes apeshit. He cuts through the walls and carves his way through the palace to get to Vivenna to save her. Yeah, I just thought, you know, Vasher and Nightblood, were really cool elements of this book. Vasher was by far the strongest character because this is kind of a redemption arc for him to redeem himself for the things that he's done in the past. And I liked how he was presented kind of as the bad guy, and it turned out he's actually not the bad guy, and that twist was pretty cool. And, you know, his whole story was just kind of way more interesting than a lot of the stuff that was going on. I do think it falters at the end, unfortunately. I think that his story, you just kind of get a lot of information about him exposited at the end, and it's not integrated into the storytelling at all in any way, interesting way, shape, or form. It's not terrible, but it's very rudimentary, just, oh, by the way, here's a bunch of important story details that I forgot to actually sneak into the plot, so I'm just going to tell you them at the end. And that's basically how it felt. This book doesn't have Brandon Sandersons, like, usually when the Sanderlanche happens, everything connects perfectly. It didn't in this book, in my opinion. I'll get more into that later, but that does kind of hamper the storyline a bit, hampers his character a bit. He's a bit less interesting for that. And again, I think that's to do with the fact that a lot of things were crunched down and forced down into one book, when knowing Brandon Sanderson, this probably was like a trilogy or something to start off with, or something like that. And, you know, it does suffer for that, in my view. But overall, Vasher was an interesting character, and I quite liked him. He's probably the most intriguing character, if not my favourite character, which is still Lightsong. But overall, a pretty great character in a cast of pretty good characters. So, you know, quite liked Vasher, thought he was cool. Next thing I want to talk about are the twists. So this book has quite a lot of twists in it. That being said, there aren't really any until the end of the first third of the book. No significant ones anyway. And the first big twist probably is finding out that Susebron is actually just kind of a chill dude. Then there is the twist that Denth, who is a mercenary that is working for Vivenna, is actually a bad guy. And that was a pretty cool twist. And that was where I actually started to find Vivenna to be slightly palatable as a character. And, you know, that was a pretty good twist in general. I'll be honest, didn't see that coming. From then on, it's just kind of twist after twist after twist. So this book has quite a lot of plot twists that are kind of coming at you. And the truth of the matter is that this is quite a short... Well, it's not short, but it's the one book, and the story feels very condensed. And even if it does have, like, some pacing issues, these twists, they keep coming in, like, pretty regularly, and they're interesting, and they're the highlights of the story. That being said, there are some twists that I think some things that should have been twists that weren't twists, because they're just told to you throughout the book in a way that feels like Brandon Sanderson just could not be asked or could not think of a way to interestingly put that into his story, so he just kind of shoved that shit in as exposition. But overall, the book, it does keep going. It's got twists and turns. It's interesting. The plot itself never really grinds to a halt, but it does slow down significantly at some portions. This has, if you like Brandon Sanderson for his like plot twists and things like that happen throughout his books, which they do happen regularly, you will like this. You will like this element of this book. So I did as well. I thought that the book's keeping me on my toes. It has that, and I did enjoy that. So I'm going to put this in the good section. I think it's worth talking about because it's a pretty significant element of what I enjoyed about the book. So this book has a Sanderlanche, and it's good. It is good. So the last third of this book is the best part of this book. In my view, it has all of the most interesting things going on. It happens very quickly. It's too much. It's not even the last third. It's like 150 pages in a 650 page book. It's pretty much the Sanderlanche. I enjoyed it. I really liked the actual Sanderlanche elements, the kind of like the last act, if you will. I read the whole thing. It took me a while to get through this. It took me about a month to read this book. And I had to start reading another book halfway through because in the middle I was kind of getting bored. The Sanderlanche, when I got to that, I just read the whole thing. The Sanderlanche was really good. It always is. You can trust Brandon Sanderson to slip that Sanderlanche in there, to have everything tied together. That being said, I do think there are elements of the story that just do not tie together very well. I'll get into this in more detail later, but specifically I'm talking about like the history of the world and how that ties into the plot. There are quite a few important things regarding some stuff that happened in the past. It's just kind of like wishy-washied in there, and it's written in a way that's almost like that's supposed to be such a big revelation, but it's not. It's just not, because it's just there. It's like, oh, okay. I don't know, when you do this kind of twist, you need there to be a lot of world-building scaffolding and things that lead up to it and keep it interesting and keep it in the forefront of the reader's mind. But what this book does is it mentions a random lore thing about the history of this country, like at page 200, and then just brings it up at the end again as if it's like important. And I'm like, wait a minute, that was important? I thought this was just random throwaway lore, and I've forgotten. I forgot, so I had to go back through the book because it was just, it wasn't like a through thread of the story. It's just kind of like mentioned in a throwaway comment in a single sentence, and then it's brought up as a major plot point later on, and it's like, it's not quite what you're gonna experience in his other books that I've read, namely the Mistborn books, which tie things together really fucking well. This felt like he was trying to do that, but he's kind of clutching at straws, and it just didn't really tie together as well. That being said, the vast majority of it does tie together fine. The actual plot itself concludes very well, satisfying ending. All the characters have an interesting end to their character arcs. It would be interesting to see what happens afterwards, you know? When a story finishes, it's quite open, but this one it's quite open, but it left me thinking, I would actually be interested in reading another one of these. I would read another one. If there was a sequel, I would read it. So, you know, the last third and the ending, pretty great. It's just not perfect. It's just not as good as I'm used to from Brandon Sanderson. It's just not everything that I want out of a Brandon Sanderson book, and I think that's fine, right? I think that's fine. Not all of his books have to be fucking incredible, you know? And it's okay. And that's fine. But overall, it's going in the things I liked, because it is part of what I really liked about reading this book, and the part that I enjoyed the most of the story. Sanderlanche and the Last Third. It's good. It's what you want out of a Brandon Sanderson book, just not as good as other books. So, the last thing I want to talk about is the setting. I liked the setting on a basic level. So what I mean by that is I just find the world of Haladron to be kind of cool. I like the world building on the level of like the culture and the society. I thought the political world building was well done. I liked how you had this minority group of Idrians who were inside of Haladron, and how that interplayed with the story and the plot and the revolution that was going on. Well, the brewing revolution that was happening. I liked seeing the Returned. I thought the religion was really interesting. I thought all the stuff regarding the Returned was super cool. And in general, I just thought the world was really fucking interesting. Not all of it. Not all of the world building I liked. But, in general, these elements of the world building I did like. You know, there are lots of little things that are unique about this setting, like Haladron, this obsession with restaurants, and how people don't cook at home, and they go out to restaurants because that's part of their society, because they're all lavish. The fact that they all wear all these clothes that are really colourful, and how that ties into the magic system. I thought that, in general, on a basic level, Haladron as a city, as a place in the world, was interesting. That being said, the Idrians are a bit fucking boring. There's not really much interesting going on with them. There's a lot of things that are implied, like the fact that their culture is all about like not being ostentatious, is probably a direct cultural rebellion to the way that Haladron is, because obviously these people would have originally been part of that culture. But it's kind of hard to say. It's kind of like just kind of implied maybe it could be that way, and that would make them a bit more interesting, but ultimately they're just kind of like sidelined, like straight away. And you know, I thought they were a bit boring. There's loads of other places that I mentioned, but it's a bit weird because it feels like Haladron is just the center of the world, but then people are constantly mentioning other places around Nalthus. So clearly this planet has lots of different societies and cultures and stuff, kind of like the Storm Archives does, but they're just mentioned in offhand comments, and that's a disconnect to me, because in Mistborn, for example, there's one clear society, right, that dominate this basically all of the world that we're shown, right? And that makes sense because it's a massive society. There's like loads of towns and cities, and they follow the powers that be. They answer to the powers that be, to the Lord Ruler and to his Inquisition, to the nobility, and that kind of all fits together well. Whereas in this, it's like, oh yeah, this country is super important. It's all a big deal, and then you realize actually it's not really a big deal. It's just a big deal to these people. But then also they have a nuclear missile, and I guess it's a secret. I don't know. They have a god king who's super powerful. Everyone knows he's super powerful and badass, but all the other countries just don't give a shit. And the world building kind of gets a bit janky when you think about like other places and how that might interact with one another and all that stuff. I thought maybe the setting would have been stronger if it had just been Haladron and surrounding towns, like being basically the equivalent of Scadrial's society being kind of monocultural, and then the Idrians being the exception, maybe. The whole thing just didn't gel as well as his other books. But I do think on a basic level, like I said, the society is interesting. The idea of it, kind of thinking about it, imagining it, is nice. The world building in this ain't as deep as most other fantasy books. It's pretty simplistic, it's pretty bare fucking bones, to be honest with you. And that makes sense, it's a standalone book. But I thought the setting on a basic level was interesting. Right. It's time to talk about the things I didn't like. There are quite a few. So we'll start with Vivenna and her story. This one's a bit of a mixed bag, but there's more bad than good, in my opinion. The main problem with Vivenna's story is the first half of it is super fucking boring. She just wanders around and it's just world building. There's no actual character arc really. There's nothing really interesting happening. She simply is the way she is, and she just slowly, way too slowly, in my view, realizes that she's a bit of a stuck-up bitch. And she is, and that's fine. There's nothing dislike her character for that. I dislike her character for the terrible fucking pacing and the awful pacing of her character arc, which I thought was just shite. For the first half of the book. However, the plot twist that Denth is actually a bad guy, or at least is working for someone within the Haladron government or something like that, we don't really know at this point, was very interesting and a really cool plot twist. And then her becoming homeless was really interesting. So I'm of two minds of this. I really did like that arc she went through. However, the main two problems I have with the story arc are the pacing. The first half of her character arc is really slow, really drawn out, unnecessarily so, in my view. And the second is its connection to the magic system. Brandon Sanderson is famous for his magic systems, okay? But the only fucking character in this whole book who can use the goddamn magic system, Awakening, in this fucking book, is her, and she doesn't learn how to do it until the last 200 pages. And she uses it like 3 times. And it's like... And her interaction with it is just fucking exposition as well. It's like, she just gets it exposited to her, and then they're like, oh yeah, you just got loads of breath, and because you're a descendant of the king, you're going to pick it up really quickly, and she does. And she barely uses it, and she shit at it. And all she does is get in Vasher's way. And it was kind of... It wasn't great, I thought. The thing is, I did like her character arc in the last half of the book. The pacing problem is, I think, what Brandon Sanderson could have done here is condensed the first half of a character arc and maybe pushed Denth's betrayal back, so it's maybe about a third of the way in the book. And then a third of the book could have been her being homeless and meeting Vasher and beginning to work with Vasher, and then Vasher would have had way more page count, and he's a really great part of this book, and it would have been great for him to have more fucking pages. And that meant that more page count could have been directed towards the more interesting character arcs that are going on, specifically Siri's and Lightsong's story. And if that had just been the case, if this had just been condensed a bit, I feel like she would have been as great a character as the rest. But because the first half of her character is so fucking boring, it really brings this whole book down. Because, to my understanding, she has the most viewpoint chapters of any character in this book. She takes up so much of the page count with so much useless, pointless shit, and it feels like the book could be... This book, if that one problem could be resolved, and if it was like... If we go back in time and redo it, that would have fixed all the problems. The magic system in this book is another thing I'm going to talk about. I don't really like that much about this book. All of the magic the magic system world building is through her character. Essentially, there are some small bits that you learn about Awakening through the other characters, because she's the only Awakener besides Vasher has any viewpoint characters, and Vasher gets like no viewpoint chapters. Sorry, Vasher gets like hardly any viewpoint chapters in the first half of the book, and quite a few towards the end, but not enough overall. And Vivenna gets loads of viewpoint chapters, and for most of the book she just bitches and moans about not wanting to use her breath. Fair enough, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that from a writing perspective, but when you combine that with the pacing and the lack of actual world building to do with the magic through the perspective of a character who can use it until the last fucking 200 pages of this book. What are you doing, Brandon? You dropped the ball, bro. You dropped the fucking ball, man. This is your thing. Like, this is your thing. Your magic systems are your thing, and you dropped the ball, man. You left it until the last fucking third. And this really brings down this character arc for me and this story. And I just thought, even though the last half of her story, everything after she becomes homeless and her kind of budding relationship with Vasher, you know, I think that Vasher rubs off on her a lot because Vasher's a super interesting character and she's not really that interesting. But yeah, she's just not that interesting. And she becomes interesting about halfway through the book, but the first half of the book, there's just not much going on there. There's just not much happening. The magical world building through her perspective is completely, in my opinion, completely neglected. And if this beginning of her character arc was condensed down to about 200 pages, the first third of the book, and Denthor's betrayal was revealed a bit earlier in, and then there could have been more focus on her using her powers and the magic from that point, then overall this would have been significantly better, and the pacing would have been fixed, and the next point I'm going to go on to, which is the magic, would have been more interesting. Unfortunately, in my view, it's just not. So I thought, although the second half of her story was good, and she was interacting with the most interesting character in this book, Vasher, it's significantly hampered by the first half. The first half I thought was really not good. That's a shame, but that's how I felt about it. This story was the reason that I struggled to read this book every time I got to one of her chapters. I was just kind of like, oh, okay, it's one of her chapters again. I guess I gotta force myself through this to get to the next bit. You know, I was really enjoying Siri and Lightsong stories and on the characters and stuff that's going on in those. But this one, until about halfway through the book, I really had to force myself to read it. It was really a blemish on an otherwise great book. So, the magic. The problems with this, as I've one of my main problems with this, as I explained in the last section, is the pacing of the One Awakener's character arc in the story. Awakening is the magic system in these books, where characters, basically every single person is born with something called a breath, which is basically like their soul. It's their investiture that they're born with from whatever shard it is who settled on this planet, one can assume. And basically, they can pass on their breath to someone else. It's kind of an economic magic system in that regard. And usually I really like these economic style magic systems where the world building is kind of tied into kind of the economics of access to magic. That is present in this magic system, but unfortunately it's just not present enough. So basically, as you get more breaths, you become more powerful, you get more abilities, and it extends your lifespan. You can get to the point where you have more and more and more, and eventually you can do loads of crazy shit. There's varying levels of it, basically, and the book basically explains these. I'll put them up here for you to see. As you can see, you get different powers as you progress, basically. And at the start of the book, Vivenna gets a wealth of breaths from a guy, and she basically has them for most of the book, and she just does not fucking use them for the first half of the book, apart from the passive abilities that she's been granted by these powers. Now, she is of the... I can't remember. It might have been the 5th heightening. I can't remember exactly. But basically, she doesn't really use these abilities at all, because she doesn't even awaken anything until halfway through the book. All of the magic, the vast majority of the world building to do the magic system is through her. There are other interesting aspects of this magic system. The Returned, for example, Susebron, for example, and his treasure that he holds, which is a massive amount of breaths. The way that Returned work, with having to be fed a breath from a child every week or they will die, that's all really interesting and was great, and I really liked that. But Awakening is, in my view, very interesting and completely underutilized in this book. I really like this magic system on a basic level. I think the visual kind of the imagination elements that captures the imagination. I like how it's tied into color. There's some elements, I've seen some art of it where like they're like releasing their breath and it's coming out of their mouths as like this actual visible effect. I think something like that would have been cool if it was actually in the book, but that's just kind of an artistic interpretation, unfortunately. There's no visible evidence that someone is using their awakening, apart from the fact that they have to speak command words in order for awakening to work. And you do have to learn how it works. You get better at it. It's easier to learn how it works the more breath you have and various things, and your breath is tied into your status in society. The poor often have to sell their breaths. If they sell their breath, you become something called a drab, who basically experiences life on a less vivid way, in a far less vivid way than the average person. Your ability to see colours is dulled and things like that. I thought the magic system was cool in that regard. I just think it's completely and utterly underutilized, and the only character who can use it doesn't fucking use it for the vast majority of the book. And there isn't enough interesting stuff going on with this character to justify her not having access to the magic system, right? Let's take Vin, for example, and Mistborn. She's a Mistborn right from the beginning. She learns her abilities very early in, and that's part of what makes the book interesting. Seeing Vin learning how these abilities work, and us learning how the magic system alongside her, is part of what makes that first experience of that first book so great. And unfortunately, this book just does not have that, and I expect every book with a magic system to have some element of teaching the reader how it works through exposition that isn't janky. Unfortunately, in this book, she just gets told how the fuck it works in one exposition dump from Vasher in a random chapter, and she just starts using it, and she just teaches herself overnight, essentially. And the whole thing was very poorly done, unfortunately, in my view. I think Brandon Sandersons dropped the ball here. I think the magic system is good and it is interesting. It's just poorly utilized in this book. And I hope, and I do hope, there will be another book set on the same planet and we will get to see more of this magic system actually get the exploration it fucking deserves. Because in my view, it just does not. It really does not. So, yeah, there we go. Unfortunately, this is heavily tied into the pacing issues and the issues with Vivenna's character arc. Maybe there could have been another viewpoint character, who could use Awakening, and maybe we would have got to see more of that magic system, but unfortunately we don't. And it's not really utilized in a very interesting way, in my view. Vasher has a bunch of cool ways that he uses Awakening in order to enhance his abilities. And when Vivenna actually starts to use Awakening herself, instead of coming up with her own applications of Awakening, she instead just picks up Vasher's second-hand kit and copies his fucking abilities, and does the same thing that he did, except shittier. And this was really a shame. This was a shame, because big part of what makes a magic system interesting is seeing characters' personalities shine through their use of their abilities, and you just don't see this at all. You don't see this at all. There's no like differentiation between characters of whether they're good at certain parts of Awakening, things like that. It just doesn't have that depth that I expect from a magic system in a Brandon Sanderson book. Maybe I'm being too harsh, but really, I really did think the ball was dropped here, unfortunately, and I just think that this is a very interesting magic system from the point of view of it conceptually, but I think the execution is poor. So yeah, there we go. Unfortunately, very unfortunate for a Brandon Sanderson book, but I am putting the magic system into the negative things I didn't like category for this book. So, I want to talk about the next thing I didn't like about this book, which is the history of this world, and its quite frankly clumsy integration into the plot. Now, I've talked about this a little bit in other parts of this video. I was talking about Vasher and the twists, but the book constantly talks to you about the history, well, not constantly, every now and then brings up the history of this world, and it's not really integrated meaningfully into the story, except it just randomly turns out that Vasher is basically like the first God King. That is basically all there is to it. It's like presented as like a big twist. Vasher like goes into his returned form, and it turns out the returned can all do that, all change their shape. It's one of their abilities that they have, and it's the reason the royal family can change their hair color changes, because they have returned blood in them. Now I don't know how the fuck that works, because returned can't have kids, but you know, obviously there is a way that has happened in the past. But nonetheless, it's just kind of a plot twist out of nowhere. It's kind of like, oh, okay, he's returned. I guess returned actually don't die if they don't have a breath every week, because they can actually have more than one breath every week and they can just live off of it. But Susebron actually knows that, and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just kind of one of those like missing pieces of the story that's just exposited to you at the end, and you're like, oh, okay. Instead of it like falling into place, it's like someone's like ramming a chess piece that doesn't really fit into place. It's kind of how it feels to me from a storytelling perspective. It just didn't work the way that I expect of Brandon Sanderson storytelling. I expect his pieces to fall into place gracefully and in a way that feels natural from my current experience of reading his books, and this was not that, unfortunately. The integration of the history of the setting I thought was clumsy. I thought it was done through a lot of really, really janky and poorly done exposition, and I thought the history just wasn't that interesting. The plot twist that Vasher is actually these two guys. So there were two guys in the history, one of them who started the war and one of them who ended it. And it turns out Vasher was both of those people. Vasher started the war and ended it. And history forgot, and instead he was kind of remembered as two separate people. I thought it was a bit of a weird cop-out kind of ending. I don't know. I thought it was kind of cool, but at the same time, it's just like, oh, okay, he's both of them. Okay, I don't know. It's just it wasn't. When I read that, I was like, alright. I'm not used to being like, alright, when I read something from Brandon Sanderson, like plot twists like that. Like I said, it's like at the end, Brandon had all these things that he had planned in the background that he wanted to tell the reader so badly, and he just couldn't work out a way to do it organically, so he just fucking exposits it to you at the end. And it just, yeah, I don't know. It just didn't work for me, unfortunately. And I thought it was clumsy. It was a clumsy integration of the history into the history of this world into its plot, in a way that I thought in his other books that I've read he did very elegantly. So there we are. Although I found the setting itself interesting, I did not find the way that the actual history of this world is integrated into the story to be well done or meaningful in any way. In fact, actually just the way it was done just took away from the book, I thought. Right, one of the last things I want to talk about, to do with the things I didn't like about this book, is the middle. Some books have a problem that I call the Meandering Middle. The Meandering Middle is the middle section of a story, doesn't have enough interesting things going on to really keep you interested. And to be honest with you, this book seriously struggled for Meandering Middle, in my view. There were multiple times where I almost did not finish this book and just went on to read the Stormlight Archives, because the middle section of this book is so slow. By the middle, I mean from about 200 pages to 350 pages. That 150 page stretch of this book is really fucking slow, with the exception of Siri and Susebron, and it picks up again when the reveal that Dent is actually the bad guy, is actually a bad guy, happen in Vivenna's story, and that's when kind of Lightsong's story is going through a bit of a lull at the same period. So Siri is the only interesting one, and even then it feels like not much progress or anything is happening. It's just kind of a lot of random shit going on, and it doesn't feel like there's steps being made towards the end of the story, And I kept reading it because I was like, oh, okay, I trust Brandon Sanderson's gonna tie all this together and it's all going to be relevant, but I still feel like a lot of the stuff that happened in the middle of this book wasn't that relevant overall, and a lot of it could have been cut out or reused or changed, and instead replaced with things that are actually meaningful, or combined with other story or other chapters to create an overall more interesting story. And I did think the middle was really slow and ambling. I think 150 pages is a lot. 150 pages is a lot to be bored. The first third of the story is really good, and the last third, is really good, but that middle section is a bit rough, apart from series chapters. That has to be taken into consideration, and I have to be honest, I didn't really find much enjoyment reading that part of the book. This is around where I picked up another book, and I started reading. This is Limmy. This is his autobiography. I think it is anyway. It's a biography of some description. I'm really enjoying it, finding it really interesting. He's one of my favourite comedians. The Limmy Show is one of my faves. So I started reading that to kind of help me get through this book. I kind of read a couple chapters, I was like, and then I went and I read some of that book, and I was like, oh, I'm enjoying this. And it kind of helped me get through. It was the sugar that helped the medicine go down. So, you know, I have to be honest about, you know, this part of the book. I just thought it was really middling. It was a meandering middle. It was boring. It was not that interesting. Although I did like a lot of these stories and arcs that are happening overall by the end, I didn't enjoy it at the time. And last, I want to talk about the last thing I didn't like about this book, which was the exposition. This book is full of very clumsy exposition. Okay, exposition is a necessary part of storytelling, and a lot of world building is done through exposition, right? We all accept that, and we know that. As a fantasy reader, you're used to exposition. If you can't deal with exposition, you're not a fan. You can't deal with fantasy. That's the reality. Most fantasy authors are expositing information at you constantly, and it's usually they find ways to get around it feeling janky, right? You don't tell someone who already knows something about the world something that they do know, because that feels wrong. You have a lot of authors use the idiot. They have a character who doesn't know what the fuck's going on, and they explain that to them, or they have a character who's uneducated and they have that explained to them. There are ways to get around exposition and make it seem like it is part of the story and seems natural, but the reality is people, you know, we don't love exposition, but we understand it's necessary. I personally do like a bit of exposition, especially if it's world-building exposition. I don't mind the character explaining something to me as the reader that I don't understand. And, you know, I know that's a bit... depends, people's mileage may vary on that. But in this book, the exposition is fucking dire. Characters get shit explained to them that they should already know. Characters get stuff like... Vivenna gets stuff explained to her all the time, even though we know that she has spent her whole life being taught how the fuck these things work. She should know how the fuck Awakening works, okay? How Awakening works is not a secret. The fucking place is full of Awakeners. There's lots of Awakeners. Awakening is a common thing within this setting. The entire fucking army is lifeless, and she doesn't know of this country she's going to be being married into. She doesn't even fucking know how it works. They couldn't have bothered to buy her a fucking book on Awakening and teach her how Awakening works, man. Like that whole thing is super janky to me. And on top of that, characters just fucking talk about the history in such a boring way, and they mention names and characters that don't seem particularly relevant at all, and so you forget them because it's like, oh, it's just a random piece of information. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Maybe I should be trying to commit every single thing that's mentioned to me to memory, but a lot of the time a writer will use signposting to make it clear to you what's important that you need to know and what isn't important that you don't need to know, right? And usually a good author is good at explaining that to you within the text in a way that's like, wink wink, remember this for later, you know what I mean? Whereas, like, this is not how it feels in this book. It is the exposition is very janky. I mean, I suppose this is very Sanderson-esque, right? It's a main complaint people have about Brandon Sanderson that I see on the web, is that his exposition is kind of janky. Now, it's the first time I've ever read a book of his where I thought, damn, that is truly some horrible exposition. This book was full of that. A lot of it. I didn't like it. I didn't like it. Especially since a lot of the plot, like, important character plot details are just straight up exposited to you at the end, which I thought was pretty shit. The exposition, didn't like it, thought it was janky, didn't like the way that a lot of important character and plot details were just exposited to you at the end because Brandon Sanderson couldn't be asked to find a way to actually get them to fit within the story. Not a massive fan of that, I have to say. I think I've said my piece, all the things that I do and don't like about this book. Final conclusions. My overall thoughts on this book is, there are things I really liked about it, things I really didn't like about it. Ultimately, I did enjoy reading this book. That being said, if it wasn't connected to the Stolen Archives, which I'm about to read, I probably never would have read this. I'm glad I did. Don't know how it will tie into some archives. I can only assume Nightblood is gonna fucking turn up at some point on Roshar somehow. The story itself is a nice self-contained story. It's okay. Most of the characters are alright. The magic system is unfortunately underbaked, in my view, underutilized. And overall, it's just kind of like, for every good thing this book has to offer, there's something that irked me. And so, I have to say, it's pretty mid. Overall, it's a pretty mid book. Would I read this book again? No. I wouldn't read this book again under any circumstances, to be honest with you. I'm more than likely going to just Google a plot synopsis and check information on Coppermind if I need to know anything about this book, if I think it's relevant and I'm reading Stormlight Archives. I'm not going to crack this book out and read it again. It's not going to have a place on my shelf. It's not a bad book. I don't want to give you the impression that I think it's a bad book. It's not a bad book, but it's not great either. I won't be recommending it to anyone. And to be honest with you, my experience with the Brandon Sanderson Cosmere fandom, people recommending things and saying, you should read this before you read this, it's been pretty bad. Because I didn't read Secret History, the Mistborn book, until after the third book in the second Mistborn series, part 2, the Bands of Mourning, that is, specifically. And I personally thought the tiny little twist at the end was not worth delaying Secret History for. In fact, I actually think Secret History is better to read if you've just read the original trilogy. It is not better to read it after that book because it's not an interesting twist finding out a certain character is still around, because the way that it's done is so anticlimactic, I thought. And even then is basically an implication. It's not like a confirmed this character's alive. It's like it could be anyone just because they say one word. I'm hoping to see that later on this becomes relevant in a way that makes me go, "Whoa, that's really fucking cool." But I bet Nightblood's just gonna turn up and it's gonna be like, "Oh, that's Nightblood," and I feel like it's not gonna be a massive difference. I mean, I guess someone like Vasher could turn up or some shit. That would be pretty cool. We'll see. I suppose I can't give my full judgment about this book because the reason I read it is because of the interconnectivity with Cosmere. I don't know if I think that the interconnectivity in this book is going to be worth reading it for, ultimately. Not the best book from Brandon Sanderson that I've read so far. The worst book, actually, of all of his that I've read. Although I don't regret reading it, it has yet to be seen whether I think it's worth reading. And I suspect the answer is probably not. Next video I'll probably be making will be about the first part of the Stormlight Archives. I think I'm going to make a video about each part as I read it. And then when I finish reading this, surprisingly down to earth and very funny by Limmy, I'll make a video about this one as well. So far, enjoying this a lot more than Warbreaker. So, yeah, if you're still watching, thank you for watching. And that has been Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson.